Okay, we're back on. Good morning again, everybody. It's nice to see some interest in the topic of type design education, which is the thin line of this morning. Before getting to today's speakers, a quick mention that at 12:30 we'll have a roundtable on type education. Our speakers have warned me that they have quite a lengthy presentation. If you have pressing questions, we'll pick one or two if there's room, and if there's not, keep them for today's upcoming roundtable on type education. Our speakers this morning are Kai Bernau, Matthieu Cortat-Roller, and Raphaela Häfliger. Do I get this right? From the Ecole School of Arts in Lausanne. Ecole stands for Ecole cantonale d'Art de Lausanne, one of the world's leading type design course in type design. And their presentation of today is about methods of teaching at the school.
Okay. Ooh. Thank you. So, thank you, Jean-Baptiste. Yeah, we managed to stay under 200 slides, but still it will be quite a fast space. So I'm just here to quickly introduce the thing, and then I will let my colleague speak. So I'm Matthieu Cortat-Roller, head of Master Type Design at Ecole since 2016. Here some contact information that might be interesting, you will see at the end. So Ecole, which is an art school in Lausanne, in Switzerland. So yeah, an art school, so a place filled with young people with laptops. But specifically in the Master Type Design, it's a place where we draw. That's basic practice for type designers, but it's really important, and a place where we design. Here I just stole this quote from an email sent by one of the teachers to students from Julia Born at the beginning of her class. I won't read it, I'll let you do it. But just stating the importance of drawing and thinking with your one hands and with image, not with concepts only. So it's a place where we draw. There's many ways of drawing. Traditional ways, like during this calligraphy workshop we did with Vincent de Boer last September. Sometime in more experimental way. Here, students playing with a musical piece from Jennifer Walshy and developed a 3D version of ink drops on paper. It can be drawing in the detail, like this project from Stefan Fitze, who is imagining that the Trajan column was destroyed by barbarians. And so this iconic model that a lot of type design history is based on is no longer existing. So what would have the type design history evolved with a different classical Roman model, which is, he found one on the Via Appia. So sometimes it's also a bit more sketchy, but quite nice. Sometimes it's drawing with a lot of spontaneity, sometimes with great care, most of the time, as a text on top and display version on the bottom, the opposite, for diploma projects. Drawing with other scripts, such as Syriac for this one, or between scripts. Here, Lana Soufe, working on the Greek font, used the Arabic script dot system for the measurement, or creating new script, which is another type of drawing. So drawing for the pleasure of playing with shapes and also looking into different direction, not strictly speaking vector type, like just the shapes of leaves. And broadening this perspective, the school has a type foundry called ECAL Typefaces, and since last week there is a new, we sell fonts, but also there is stories, and this one is the thesis of one of the students. He did it in the form of a podcast interviewing designers who are like multidisciplinary designers, and it's called Master of Many. But let's go into one precise class students have in the first semester of their first year of the program, and that's the class of my dear colleague and friend, Kai.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Kai. I've been teaching at Ecole for, I think, 11-ish years now. And I wanted to talk a little bit today about my first semester calligraphy class. And it will surprise nobody that I have sort of chosen this as a good sort of access or model for type design, because I studied there with all of my beautiful, wonderful teachers who are sitting there in the back. The spirit of Gerrit Noordzij has sort of rained down on me. And I think it's a really useful and practical model, you know, an approximation of type design. It's very good to talk about the rhythm of positive and negative shapes or shape groups through the lens of writing, as well as about the idea that different writing tools have different formal properties like built into them, so expressed in the shape that a tool favors that are easy to make with it. And importantly, it's not only the calligraphic tool that shapes the formal repertoire, but also sort of the body that operates it. The body and the pen together favor certain movements, and it will be those resulting shapes that make up a larger portion of the shapes that are present in any given alphabet. So it starts harmless enough. We faff around a little bit with normal calligraphy, just about a day or so, and it's nice and it's a bit messy. And I cannot stress enough, by the way, the advantage of writing really rather large, because then you don't just move your wrist, you move your whole arm, and sort of a big bulldog clip and a sponge cloth is all you need to like build a nice tool for yourself. So we do a bit of that, just enough to get sort of a feel of it. And I think that's really important, right? There is, in many languages, there is a word for understanding something with your hand, to grasp, begreifen, and so on. And in this case, you feel what the pen wants to do, the shapes that the pen favors, so to speak. And what the students will understand very quickly is that the tools we use influence the shapes we make. So, if we want to make new shapes, and that's the title of the class, Tools Make Shapes, because specific tools have always left an impression of their own intrinsic formal qualities. We don't think of them that much when we look at type, but it's interesting to notice how much the specifics shape the way we look at and make type. So I'm going to explain the class a little bit now, and then I'll tell you why this class exists, and then I'll tell you why it really exists. And then we sort of look beyond that into the field of type design and see some other examples that are pertinent to sort of a certain way of thinking that I'm trying to teach. And then I'm going to tell you what's really the point of the class. So in 10 minutes, I hope. So the class runs the whole first semester. From September to January or so, we meet around once a month. That's like 5-ish times in total. And the students, they build all kinds of interesting tools. Some are quite big and action-oriented, like this is a little prototype for a go-kart that rides with his back axle. Some tools are more cerebral and careful. This is a rather old but really good example. It's an ambidextrous script that has to be written with both hands simultaneously, because the pen sort of follows the line of a scanner, the sensor line. Sometimes the tools are not as much built as they are, how do I say that charitably, recontextualized. But the specifics of the tools can still make for quite interesting writing experiences. So, and then it usually goes like this after the writing is grasped, as it were. Alphabets get refined, and I always like to ask students also to make a writing manual that shows like the order of the strokes and the direction of the strokes where applicable. And then digital typefaces are created. So these found tools, when people don't build their own tools, but when they find tools, sometimes it gets a little bit out of hand. The dimensions become somewhat absurd. But the process then of systematization, of finding out what shapes this thing can make, systematizing them, this doesn't show so well, and then, making a credible typeface out of it are still the same. Sometimes the tools, it's interesting, they are very restrictive in what kind of shapes they can make, what movements they permit. This is just like a tape roller at the end of a 2x4. But the restriction that it imposes is really interesting. Like, you can only make downward strokes. You can't make really big curves because of the tension of the tape itself. It's very vertical oriented, and yet, like, it results into like a huge variety of shapes that, on the one hand, look like French Renaissance italics, on the other hand, look like Brazilian pichação graffiti. This is a project that puts a lot of emphasis on the bodies that are involved in the writing. And the video sort of makes it clear how certain movements are favored by the bodies executing them, and other movements are more difficult. And some movements are, of course, not possible, and then the construction of the letter shapes has to work around that, as it does with any kind of handwriting. The two-color stroke is sort of an additional explanation about how the strokes function. And what's really nice about this project is that you can even see like how a body's position while writing influences the movements that you can or cannot make. So there's actually two different typefaces, or writing alphabets, one for sitting down and one for standing up. In this case, the assignment turned into some sort of team building exercise, I guess. So two people are writing simultaneously, and the only thing they can do is like pull on these two strings. So the first thing they needed to do was develop some sort of a meta language to agree on how to draw a certain shape. And then, the calligraphy that you can make with that is very restricted. You can't lift the pen off the paper and so on. And in fact, this sort of mono-stroke alphabets, they occur very often. And it's very interesting how they are super, super similar, even if the tools that they are made with are completely different. This one is nice because the tool changed so much during the process of the project. It starts out with the idea of having like a rotating contrast, like, the pen sort of rotating around the skeleton, as it were. So they built some sort of a little attachment that you put on a power drill, so that you could, write things like this. And they tested different nibs or drill bits just to get an idea what's going on with the stroke. But then they noticed that, well, this is really hard because a drill wants to spin very fast, and we need more control. So they laugh, and they say, haha, why don't we build a gearbox to attach to this? And they do. And still, the material quality cannot match what they have in their heads. And that's the moment when they radically change tools, and they start constructing prototypes in processing, I think, where they have the possibility to apply like different rotation directions and rotation speeds onto like different kinds of skeletons. And this goes on for a while, and they try to understand that, what kind of shapes come out of that. And then it becomes more normal sort of vector drawing again. But like not really shapes that you would have come up with otherwise. So what's the point of all this? Like all sort of calligraphy exercises, it teaches you about rhythm and construction and shape groups, like that there are certain kinds of shapes that repeat throughout an alphabet. It's nice to understand something with your hands, and it's just crazy fun. Like it's really, I mean, for me. I don't want to speak for the students. But what's really the point of it is they're not just working on the computer all the time. It's really good to start people early on working collaboratively and in groups, because as you may know, that's kind of where we're all going. as projects become too big for like one person to handle, and then, you know, compromising and sacrificing become important skills. And it's really great for students that come to us from a background that, you know, maybe they haven't drawn type before, or maybe they're not very familiar with the computer in general, or maybe they're just not familiar with the Latin script, which is still sort of the focus of our program. And most importantly, like this attitude, like, okay, if you want to make new shapes, then maybe you need new tools, or maybe you need to invent new methods. I don't know if you've seen the talk from Underwear this morning. So new tools or new methods that result in new shapes. And I think that's really important, because you know what? We're all using the same tools now. And there have been different attempts at how to use the computer for making typeface. I think largely we have coalesced around the idea that the Bezier curve for drawing and interpolation to save time. And while these tools do not impose a certain way of working, as Carter describes so eloquently in this really good TED Talk, I think it's very clear that, like any tool, Bezier drawing favors a certain way of writing. It makes certain things easy, dead lines that are dead straight, and curves that have this mathematical smoothness of the Bezier format, and it makes certain other things more difficult, straight lines that are not actually straight, curves that are kind of subtle, the spark of life from the human hand that the machine can never capture. And I think I always felt it's really interesting to explore and amplify what a tool wants to draw, and recent type design history is littered with examples. So what started out as a reaction to technical restrictions became some sort of an exploration of some native or inherent formal repertoire of the format, and is now a fairly popular style of drawing, maybe because we feel that this approach is true to the material. But maybe material now, that's a misnomer for the straight lines and the Bezier curves, because what modern typefaces are made of is actually this. It's maths, it's numbers. And maybe the first ones to understand that the digital letter shapes are just numbers, and to use that in a creative way are those two lovely nerds there in the back. So making new tools with digital drawing means that programming tools, like we see them here, you know, as creative tools for design, something that expands our possibility space. For example, here in the work of Vera van der Sijp, she navigates between programming software and hacking hardware to initiate sort of a typographic dialogue between digital and analog worlds, or this monster by Conrad Davenport, which is a variable color font that has like the 3 layers for RGB and then 4 or 5 variable axes. So there is 96 versions of every glyph that need to be made. And of course, you can't do that by hand. So the only way to make this typeface is to make your own tool that draws them for you. Similar but completely different is the work of the Dutch designer Hansje van Halem. Her typographic and lettering compositions, handwork and programming interweave, no pun intended, well, kind of intended. And it's often impossible to say, you know, which parts of her work are executed by a computer and in which part she herself acts as a robot. Her typeface Wind, that was produced with Tom Janssen, is like a crazy cool variable font. I think it's higher order interpolation, but I'm not quite sure. Or maybe you, a brand new thing. So typefaces like Beowulf and Obsidian and Wind, they needed a mindset of understanding that while a designer can't make these shapes by hand, they can make tools that make them for them. Programming informs self-sufficiency in a way of thinking that assumes that a problem can always be solved, whether that problem is to create a new shape or because you have to do something elaborate and time-consuming 100 times. And understanding just the tiniest bit of code is enough to also understand that complex code is like lots of bits of simple code stacked on top of each other. So, what's the point of this exercise? Critical thinking should be a major focus of any design education, and that includes critical thinking about your tools. There's software that offers automatisms and magic solutions that sort of stifle any thought of how could this be done, or why is it done in this way here. So it's a bit like Instagram, but everybody can push the same button, you know? So I want to teach about creative empowerment and self-reliance through making things yourself instead of tool dependency. And this is a tiny first step. If you want to implement a course like this yourself, it's crazy fun. I encourage you to do it. Let me know. I have tips for you. I'd like to introduce Raphaela now, a graduate from our course in 2022. And since then, one of our most kind and wonderful assistants. Raphaela comes from a hardcore typography background, and I think her project shows that. Raphaela.
Hello. Hello. Thanks for the introduction. Yeah, I'm happy to be here and have the chance to present my diploma project that I have done at Ecole last summer. And to stay within the topic of this talk, I'd like to focus on the methodology that I used. So as Kai already mentioned, my background is in editorial design, and my preoccupation has always been typography. So when it comes to web design, I always had a slight rejection against it because the lack of control due to responsiveness and the dynamic nature. So when I did a master in type design, I actually found out that I have now new opportunities and new perspective for this problem. My first finding, or the starting point for my project, lies actually at the ATypI talk by Lasse Pfister, who is present today, where he was introducing an algorithm that is able to calculate white spaces on a text of line. So I contacted Lasse, and he explained me how the code is working, and he explained me that there is existing typefaces that can be combined with this code. So if we have a look on this, on how this code works, the black boxes that I highlighted are the white spaces. And the algorithm is able to calculate these white spaces and sums them up on the left side. And these specific value of the amount of possible white spaces can then be connected to a variable font with an axis between a more wide and a more narrow cut. So my project was kind of set. I wanted to draw a sturdy text typeface that is able to even out the white spaces without really recognizing it. So it has to offer an axis that goes from slightly more narrow to slightly more wide. When we go back in time, or throughout time, we actually encounter that this idea of an even texture is nothing but new. Because when we see Gutenberg, when he printed his 42-line Bible in already 1450, it's still a standard that we are looking for to reach. So the secret of Gutenberg was that he had a character set containing up to almost 200 glyphs. So as it already lies in the nature of the manual typesetting that you need more A's to set a page of text, he was clever enough to alternate them like in width, but also more radically chopped off some serifs, some upstrokes, or inserting alternates or ligatures. So for me, this was quite surprising that such an old technology was actually so much more flexible and dynamic as its digital descendants. So if you think of scalable vectors, it's like super fixed. And I wanted to implement this as well in my typeface, so thinking of a letter as its own scope, or as we already heard, thinking of letter shapes that they behave differently. This actually led me to another finding, and a different way of seeing letter shapes than today's industry standard. So in 1977, Donald Knuth, a computer scientist and mathematician, developed a program language called MetaFont out of the desire to improve his typographical quality of his publication. Instead of describing its outlines, like most other font formats, its shapes are based on the movement of the stroke of the pen, so its strokes are described as variable parameters. What I took from Knuth was, again, its methodology, so splitting up a letter in different parts to receive at the end the perfect value of each to implement in my typeface. So as you can see on the left side, it's the computer modern from Donald Knuth, and on the right side, it's an animation I did to show the different examination points I was looking into. So I defined multiple exclamation points applied to different letter and shape groups to create a parametric font containing up to 20 different layers or axes only for testing reasons. I took the perfect value of each to implement the optimum of its extremes into one single combined variable font. So I used the technique of parametrization only for testing and examination reasons, and at the end, ending that picking all the values that I was, for me, considered the perfect values to combine them in one axis. So now I like to have a look on some of the examination points. The most obvious ones are the proportions, which is the white inner space on the left and the right, the black of the letter. In a parametrical understanding, this means the X transparent axis on the left and the X opaque on the right. So if I did some testing within the X transparent axis, I found out that an unproportional treatment would suit best. So I had to deal with round shapes differently than straight ones. So for example, I assumed that the letter O has already a lot of white space, so I can change it a lot more than straight ones. But actually I was mistaken. When I did my test, I found out that the O is super important for the rhythm of the text, and if I would shrink it too much, the line would stand out a lot. So another delicate part is the stems, so the black part. And when Hermann Zapf and Peter Karoff introduced in the early 1990s their HES-SO program, also to achieve the quality of text typesetting by Gutenberg, also by expanding and condensing letter shapes, they were actually also cared the most about the stems. So they were afraid by scaling them proportionally that they would become too light. So for sure, when I did the same thing, I found out that if I would scale them proportionally, they would become too light. But on the other hand, if I would keep them exactly the same, like sustaining the stems, they would end up too black, as I already lose a lot of white space within the X opaque axis. So I had to define or adjust them only optically, like minor point sizes. So other smaller attributes I was looking into was, for example, the serif on the left side. And on the right side, you can see some testing I've done on the behavior of the curve. So observations on the curvature. This means the idea was when the letter is shrinking, I would square up the curve that I can intervene a bit more of white space in it, which was a clever idea, but at the end also when I tested, I found out that I had to deal with that super delicately, because when it goes from line to line, the squareness is also super important for the rhythm, and it would appear as a totally different typeface in running text. So back to the serifs as well, I had to deal with an unproportional treatment. So if you think of letter groups, this time diagonals against straights, if you imagine a V that has already like tight side pairings but a lot of white space underneath, it has not the same room for the serifs to grow or shrink than a straight letter, like for example, the N. So I did a lot of testing, as you can see, for example, the N's against the V's with different values, but also shapes against shapes, shape groups against shape groups, and also in running text. And building on the research by Johannes Amon, a German designer who was suggesting introducing alternates and ligatures, like expressive ones, I went for a much more subtle approach. So some of my letters are disconnecting, and when it comes to ligatures, I only insert the ligatures on a certain point on the axis. Below that point, I draw some alternate letter combinations. So for example, the F would shrink down that it can be spaced underneath a L, and only on a certain amount on the axis it would really connect to a full ligatures. So with all these different visual tricks and examinations and observations, I was totally able to work, the font was able to work with the code from Lasse, as you can see on the right side. So with an even texture and a nice justification. But also going back to the offline world, when I was in InDesign, I realized that this additional axis that I called typo axis is a quite useful tool. So being a Swiss typographer and thinking of this long and short rhythm of the flags on the right side, which is questionable, I know, I was totally able to do that without falling back to glyph scaling or intercharacter spacing or like tracking leading. So as you can see, these values on the left side, they're showing the position on the axis of the variable font. So from line to line, it's just another position. So this in mind, I went back to Lasse, and after a philosophical discussion, if it's good or not, we decided he was totally able to implement that in his code, so it's now possible to make this rhythm as well. And as well on the right side, some crazy shape forms. So what certainly stands out of my research is the implementation of repetition. So although we have now been equipped with the most energetic tool from modern technology, the fundamental concepts have often been already established methods that stood the test of time and manifested themselves over centuries. So I like to end my talk with this quote from the Type from the Underwear. The introduction of the open type variable font format confronted type designer with a new concept of letter forms, pointing to new possibilities which weren't previously possible. Instead of wrapping old ideas into new technologies require new ideas. But to come up with new ideas, we first need to understand the new technology. And with this in head, I'd like to hand back the mic to Matthieu Cortat, who will introduce you.
Yeah. This. So yeah, to end this talk, I would just like to introduce a project that we are quite likely to do. We're still waiting for the for the funding answer to get the money to start it. And I have to quote them, it's the Réseau de compétences design et art visuel of the Haute École spécialisée de Suisse occidentale. So it's called BB, it's the abbreviation of Beyond Bezier. And the idea is rather simple. You're all familiar with this, which is the industry standard since quite a while now. Most of the things we see during the conference has been designed with Bezier curves. So as any other technology, Bezier curves comes with possibilities, but also limitation, automatisms, or even plugins which helps you to draw faster, reducing the risk of making mistakes, but also reducing the risk of being creative. So these projects started with this group of colleagues, some of whom are present here, teaching in the Master Type Design. We are joined by a duo of mathematicians, Micha Vassem and Florence Sierli, and an art historian to get out of the nerd stuff, you know, and Raphaela coordinating the whole thing. So it should be an 18-month project starting in September, during which we would like to experiment in not all, but as much as possible ways of drawing letter forms without vectors. We defined several axes that we will inquire in, one being the stroke, And all the axes being inquired in both digital and analog ways. One being the strokes, the notion of skeleton and modulation, and kind of what you introduced in your class, tools make shape. Another approach would be the notion of surface, the type design as a sculpture. You know, you dig or you add material, or you cut letter forms here. A design made by Adrian Häfliger with the scissors in paper, in photo composition, for photo composition paper, with the idea of the letter forms being volumes. Another axis is led by Radim Peshko, is the collective, that we still live in this very romantic approach that there is a single mind behind any creation and the individual and the genius, which actually does not have to be. So, for instance, in different workshops with students, Radim, for instance, asked them to reproduce the same text and pass it over to other students and to experiment with walks in the city, discussing with the population and the geography. You know, not, and I illustrated this with the Bible, that it was not written by one single person, but it's the creation of a group. Yeah, of course, obviously, one of the axes will be the notion of artificial intelligence and how it can influence, modify, or improve design practice. Last semester, one of our students tried to, I don't remember which one it was. Do you remember, Alice, maybe? No, students, it's Eran Ben Barak, but the AI tool. Midjourney. I was trying to get Midjourney to draw a good ampersand, and they don't speak the same language. So here, I think that's the early ampersand. And as Kai already said earlier, basically a Bezier curve is this. It's math. It's a calculation system. But actually, there is many different ways of calculating a curve, and maybe those different methods. You know, we have the little handles, and maybe there is other way that it could be done, achieve curves. And so we hope in a couple of years to maybe be back at the ATypI conference or somewhere to show the result of this research. Don't hesitate to contact us if you have ideas of stuff you would like to share about those. Thank you very much. Okay.